start my tale in Burleson County. But today I'm going to sort of have a talk with two parts. The first part I'm going to talk about relates to the western side of the Brazos there in Burleson County. I'm going to talk about a levee system they put in there. And then the second part of the talk I'm going to talk about today has to do with this book she was talking about, because I have a feeling that's why I was invited to be the speaker today. Okay, going back to Burleson County, we know that since you guys are all interested in history, you know the importance that cotton growing played in building the early economy of this part of the state. And if you just look at the figures from Burleson County, we can see that by the late 1800s, significant amounts of cotton were being grown here. But there was a problem, because in the midst of all this, there were historic floods. And during the early recorded history from Anglo settlement in the area, the floods didn't do all that much damage because there weren't that many people here. But by the latter part of the 19th century, floods were starting to be a real economic problem. And there was a flood in 1899 that got an awful lot of people's attention, followed by another one in 1908 that was just downright aggravating. And so the subject of flood control kept coming up. And early on, flood control was something that people did by themselves. They built berms around their property, around the most important aspects in their property, around a barn or something, so that they could deflect the water. They weren't exactly controlling it, but they were trying to deflect it around some parts of their property that they considered the most valuable. But it was something that was done at the scale of individual landowners. We can document that in several ways. One way is I found this letter in the state archives. It's from a property owner. This was as late as 1916, this particular letter. But in this, he's addressing the newly appointed Drainage and Reclamation Commissioner, Dr. Stiles in Austin. And I highlighted one paragraph here. And in particular, in this paragraph, it says, "This levee was constructed under private agreement by all parties owning land within the levee." So the point I'm trying to re-emphasize here is just that flood control, that was up to the individual people whose property was there. It wasn't something that they looked to government for help on. But that began to change after the flood of 1899 and the serious economic impact it had. The Texas Constitution, for those of you historians who know, is kind of a complex document. And it was amended, it prohibited funds for being used for flood control. It was amended in 1904 and again in 1907 so that it was now possible to utilize some tax funds for flood control. And the local citizens took notice of that, and here from an article in May of 2008 from the Dallas Morning News, we can see that several prominent local residents, mostly from Bryan, but they also had a head who was from Burleson County. They went to the Burleson County Commissioner's Court, petitioned them to allow them to issue bonds and tax for the purpose of building a levee in Burleson County. The reasons given for justifying this were economic. And if you look at this article from the Dallas Morning News, which I know you can't read from where you're sitting, but I can see it right here. It says, people having farms along the Brazos River in Burleson County have already taken steps to protect themselves from the overflow of that stream. This is in 1908. It says 6 out of the last 7 years, they have suffered to varying degree. And this year their losses have been so heavy as to move them to action. The stretch they propose to levee begins at Mosley's Ferry, almost opposite Bryan. So we're talking about that place basically where Highway 21 crosses the Brazos today. That's where the levee was going to start. And it was going to extend downstream 27 miles as the river meanders. At the lower end of the levee, it will be necessary to build at almost right angles a levee about 3 miles long to throw off the water that comes from the hills. The hills, they mean the area around Clay in Washington County, okay? So that altogether the project calls for the building of almost 30 miles of levee. This will protect about 50,000 acres of land that is in cultivation, and according to a preliminary estimate, the cost will be about $200,000. Basically, they're talking $4 an acre. So they're making this economic argument. If they just spent $4 an acre, they could have had a levee that would have protected the crop. And the crop was worth a lot more than that. So why not do it? And then it talks about how both the planters and the farmers were in agreement with this. And it talked about the economic disparities between those different groups. But it said it didn't matter which group was involved in this. Both groups were in favor of this. So the next year in April, the Commissioners Court in Burleson County approved this. By a local vote, can you believe this? 175 to nothing. They were in agreement on this, and so they issued bonds, 40-year bonds, and a year later construction began under the leadership of Texas A&M professor, civil engineering professor J.C. Nagel. There's a lot of interesting information about this that you can pull out of both the local newspaper and the Dallas Morning News, talking about how they were going to do this. They talked about bringing in 90 laborers. In this article, it describes the number of mule teams they were going to bring in, the scrapers, the number of tents, how they were going to bring all this in from Memphis, Tennessee on a special train to Bryan, Texas. Now, I've included here a shaded relief map of the Brazos Valley that I made, and basically this map starts up here at the northern end of the map. We've got the Brazos as it goes through Waco. And you can see as the Brazos goes through here, passing our county and Burleson County, I hope you can see, there's this kind of wide, flat spot in here. And this wide, flat spot is the floodplain of the Brazos. It's 8 to 10 miles wide. And this is the place where it is the widest between Waco and the southern end of our county. And I also notice that on the west side, the river clings to the western side of the floodplain until it gets to our county, and then it abruptly crosses the floodplain and then follows the eastern side. That wasn't lost on the people of this area. They decided to use this eastern high bank of the Brazos as a natural levee on this side of the river. They didn't need a levee on this side. The flooding was always over here. So the Burleson County landowners wanted to to kind of trap the river up against this high bank. So this yellow line that I've drawn here was the line of the levee, this 27-mile levee that they proposed to build. And it was to protect all of this valuable acreage where the cotton was grown. So they came up with this Burleson County Improvement District Number 1. There's a detailed description, meets and bounds description of every property included in this, which I found over in the courthouse at Caldwell. The problem is the map was missing. Of course, I'm a geographer. I want to see the map, right? I don't want to read a meets and bounds description of this. No way. Well, I couldn't find the map. And so you can possibly imagine the excitement I found when I discovered this map in a miscellaneous folder buried in the archives in Austin, the state archives. Miscellaneous reclamation folder, I found this map. And the map itself is about that big. It's a big map. I got it restored with the help of the state archivist, and a reduced copy of it I've put on the wall with magnets over there if you guys want to look at it later on. But it's a cadastral map. I find it fascinating. It shows the land ownership of all the blocks of land that are included within this reclamation district. This is a map. Here's the Brazos River. Here's north. Our county is here. Burleson County is here. This is all the land and all the landowners that were included in this levee district that was taxed in order to build the levee. And the levee itself is shown in detail on this map, marked by mileage. I want to point out to you this slough, Melman Slough in here, because it became a problem later on in this area at 9 miles, which continues to be a problem today. Levee construction. They didn't use anything fancy. Shovels, humans, mules. This picture is from Harper's Weekly back in 1884. It's an etching showing, engraving showing construction techniques. You'll notice the show of force. We have a guard here. This is obviously post-slavery, but the laborers were being treated almost as slaves in this picture. We see rough techniques. We see them using wheelbarrows, moving dirt up on across scaffolding, taking the dirt from the area immediately adjacent to the river and just piling it on top of the river itself to make an earthen levee. Quite a primitive technique, but it's the technique that was used throughout the South in levee construction. Here's a picture of levee construction from the archives of the Library of Congress, again showing human labor, wheelbarrows going across boards, dumping dirt. This picture I got out of a book, Photographs of Baton Rouge, 1863 to 1910. I love this picture. If you look closely, you can see these rather tall scaffolds up to maybe 12 feet high with a board across the top. They're using labor from the Angola prison there in Louisiana to push wheelbarrows of dirt up across here. If you look closely, you can see these pits from which they were extracting the soil to dump up here. And you can see it leaves a little trail, a little place upon which the scaffolding can be placed. Typical levee construction. I believe that is exactly the technique that was used on the levee we're talking about here in Burleson County. And I say that because I'm showing, first of all, the documentation from the newspapers. But this is an aerial photo of the Brazos River. And if you look at it, this is the levee. And if you look real closely, there are these little regularly spaced tick marks on the levee. And those regularly spaced marks would be those areas where the scaffolds were placed. And the borrow pits, as they call them, sometimes it was borrow, sometimes barrow, where they dug out the dirt to pile on top of the levee, would be in between these little markers. They're kind of hard to see from where you're sitting, but if you will examine these aerial photographs, they're pretty obvious. Here's another set of aerial photos from the same area. Here's the levee itself. Maybe I picked this one because I thought maybe these were a little bit easier to see. This would have been where the ramps were located, the scaffolds upon which the laborers carted the dirt up to the top of the levee itself. The camp conditions were reported to be pretty bad by today's standards. Slavery had been abolished, but people were not treated very well in these positions. How do we know that? I refer you to a story about John Lomax. John Lomax got a degree in English from TU. And he came to work at Texas A&M. And in 1910, he was teaching English at Texas A&M. And he was interested in the songs that the laborers might be singing. He was interested in things like folk songs, cowboy music, songs that would be original to a culture. He wanted to do a master's degree working on this subject, but his professor at the University of Texas wouldn't allow it. He didn't think that was appropriate academic study. Eventually, he found two professors at Harvard who agreed that was something worthwhile. But the year he spent at Texas A&M teaching literature on our campus happened to be the year they were building this levee nearby on the Brazos River. And he knew about it, and so he went over to the levee and he talked to the laborers. He listened to their music. He tried to record it. He wrote down the words of the songs they were singing after he befriended him. And he tried to write them in the exact dialect they were written in, because he thought the dialect was an important part of the culture of that time and that group of people, and he wanted to try to preserve it. So he did so with his writing, and here's excerpts from the Levee Camp Holler. We get up in the morning so doggone soon, can't see nothing but the stars and moon. Can't see nothing but the stars and moon. Heard a mighty rumbling down about the water trough. Must been the skinner whopping hell out of the walking boss. Captain got a 44 and he tried to play bad. Take it this morning if you make me mad. Captain, will you send me some water? Ain't had none since this long morning, Captain. Don't you think it's mighty hard? Work me all day on molasses and lard. So I think John Lomax has done quite an interesting service preserving for us some of what it was like as a worker on the levee. There's another interesting story related to that. I'm showing you here a picture of a woman named Dink. I don't quite know how to tell you guys this, but to quote from my dissertation here, there was a problem in the levee camps. There was a problem with the workers. There was a problem because after they got through with their boring job in the day, they'd get drunk and they'd fight. And they'd fight each other with razors. And it was hard to keep up a workforce that way. So to alleviate boredom and escape drudgery, the men bought liquor from the company store and roamed the camp at night, fighting viciously with razors. These drunken brawls impeded the men's ability to report for work before dawn. So what did the contractor do? This contractor from Memphis, Tennessee, who hauled all these guys over here to work anyway. He decided what they needed was a boatload of women. And so he went to Memphis and he got a boatload of women and he brought them over to the levee camp and he dumped them out. And to quote from John Lomax's book here, he described what happened. The two groups of men and women had never seen each other until they met on the riverbank in Texas, where the white levee contractor gave them the opportunity presented to Adam and Eve. They were left alone to mate after looking each other over. While her man built the levee, each woman kept his tent, toted the water, cut the firewood, cooked, washed his clothes, and warmed his bed. So, that's how they kept the levee workers in line. That's how they kept them alive. And this, Dink, is one of those workers. John Lomax went down to the levee and he met her. He tried to get her to tell her story, and she was very reluctant. But after supplying her with quite a bit of gin, she started singing for John Lomax, and he recorded her words with this right here. This is what she sang to him. Some folks say that the worry blues ain't bad. It's the worst old feeling I ever had. Get you 2, 3 men so one won't worry your mind. Don't they keep you worried and bothered all the time? I'm going to the river, sit down on the ground. As the blues overtake me, I'll jump overboard and drown. My mother told me when I was a child about these men's and whiskey would kill me after a while. Told my mother not to weep and moan. I do the best I can, 'cause I's a woman grown. I flag the train and keep on easing by. I fold my arms, I hang my head and cry. John Lomax went looking after Dink a few years later in Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta, and somebody pointed out to a distance in the hill and said that's where she's buried. Okay, so the levee was built in 1910. It lasted till 1913. Flood in December 1913 broke the levee. I was able to map the breaks in the levee because I also found in the state archives a report written by the engineer, J.C. Nagel, and it goes foot by foot across the 27 miles of the levee, surveying in the breaches, how wide they were and how deep they were. So I was able to take this information, put it into my GIS, Geographic Information System program, and generate this map showing where the breaks were. And if you look real closely, the river's in blue, the levee's in black, and there are these little yellow spaces on here. And everywhere there's a yellow space was a place where the levee broke during that flood. So you can see there are a couple of places that were particularly hard hit. One was up here on the north end at Millman Slough, and another place was down here in and around mile 9. I'll show you a little bit more about some of that. I'll refer you back to this shaded relief map that I showed you before, and you'll notice that at the start, this is where the river changes course from the west bank of the floodplain to the east bank, and that's where the first major breach was. Seems to me this is an obvious problem area. If the river's flooding through here, and they actually even made a little hook in the levee, it seems like an obvious place to trap the water. I mean, I'm not a civil engineer, but if I were going to guess where there'd be a problem in the levee, I might guess it would be that place. And yes, that was the first place it broke. The other place it broke was down here, and that's not as obvious a place. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later. But what the people decided to do was rebuild the levee. It wasn't tall enough. They had built it 2 feet taller than the Great Flood of 1899, thinking that rivers wouldn't go higher than that. And that obviously wasn't high enough. So they, based on encouragement from, actually it was the mayor of Navasota, who reported that the levee held. The levee held until it was overflowed, until the water topped it. So clearly the problem was it wasn't tall enough. It wasn't that there was a problem with the idea of the levee, it just wasn't big enough. So they rebuilt it. They made it taller and they made it wider. And it lasted 7 years. Okay, I mentioned mile 9 of the levee, and I want to zoom in on that a little bit. This is an aerial photograph from 100 years later, showing the course of the Brazos today. In this fluorescent green color, I've marked on here the path of the river as shown on the 1910 map. Okay, so this is where the Brazos went in 1910 in the vicinity of mile 9, and this is where it is today. And this little white line is where the levee was. So you can see as this river has migrated in this direction, the levee, it's on the wrong side of the river. They recognized there was a problem with that, and when they rebuilt this levee in 1914, they moved it a little bit south, but they didn't move it nearly far enough south. So it breached again almost immediately. Rivers are living, breathing entities too. Rivers move. Okay, today there are remnants of the levee in the landscape. You can go down Highway 50 through Burleson County and take off on one of the county roads toward the river, and you may see this. This is a view looking toward the river, and here's the levee itself. It's very much intact at this location. If you go on the back side of the levee, this is what it looks like. This is between the levee and the river. Here's the levee. You can see this vegetation in here. That's from the borrow pit, right? This is a lower spot, and much of the year, unless it's a drought year, there's water in here. So the vegetation's a little different in what was the borrow pit, right here, from the levee itself. The effects of the levee. You know, immediately, 180 people and almost all the livestock in the Brazos Bottom were washed away in that 1913 flood. In the longer term, it's had a residual effect through taxation. It's gone on into the 60s. As a matter of fact, there's still, in the Burleson County records today, there's still property classified as part of a levee district. But the levee also had an impact in terms of people changing their thinking pattern about appropriate ways of flood control in this part of Texas. And they convinced the powers that be that maybe levees didn't work so well here, and that maybe constructing things like earthen dams across rivers rather than parallel to rivers to keep them in might be a better strategy. Now, I know in other parts of the country earthen dams are still quite effective. I lived in Baton Rouge the spring of 2008, and I saw the effectiveness of the levee. It kept the water out of the LSU campus where I was at the time, but here they proved to be ineffective. What's left of the levee today, you might see this. There's a historical marker on Highway 50 a mile south of 21, giving some information about it. And you can see, if you look closely, the levee right here. And you see the tree is on the back side of a little hill. That's a remnant of the levee itself in the landscape today. Now, you'll notice I didn't show you guys a picture of the levee in question. It's because I don't have one. But maybe this is one. This is the closest thing I've been able to find that might be the levee that I'm talking about. This is from the archives at Texas A&M. It's filed under something related to March to the Brazos Camp in 1914. It looks to me like this may be the levee. It looks to me, if the cadets actually marched across Jones Bridge to the Burleson County side and camped out, that this would have been a borrow pit, and this might possibly be the levee, and they might possibly be camped out on top of it. I'm speculating here. I don't know this. But so far, this is the best thing, the earliest possible picture I have found of this particular levee, and I don't know if it really is or not. That gets me to kind of lead into the second part of my talk. Pictures, old photographs. I'm really interested in that kind of thing. And I'd like to point out that Arcadia Publishing, that's their specialty. Arcadia Publishing has put out over 6,500 books in a series, most of which is called Images of America. And they've gotten people to collect images from all over the U.S. and document them in these books. And so I did that for Brian. This was published last year, and I believe this is why I was invited to give this talk. And while I was putting this talk together, I spent a great deal of time at the Carnegie History Center in downtown Bryan. And I came across a series of negatives that they didn't realize they had. And I printed up the negatives, and they were of Brazos River flooding, or I thought they were. They were of flooding. This is one of them. And I got excited because when I was working on my dissertation, I wanted to include some historic images of Brazos River flooding, and I knew they were really hard to come by. And it looked like maybe this was a treasure trove of that sort of picture. And so I printed them up, and I tried to identify them. I was interested to see if this was Brazos River flooding, where might it be occurring? And remember, I said this was the high side of the Brazos, but flooding did occur down here in the southern part around Allen Farm, and flooding occurred up here around Steel Store between the Brazos and the Little Brazos. Could it have been flooding from one of those areas? So I printed up these pictures, and I thought maybe this would be the most definitive one because it shows a little town. Could I find somebody who could recognize that town? And I knew about the historical preservation efforts of Bill Terrell down in the Allen Farm area in the southern Brazos County. So I took all my pictures down to Bill and spread them out and showed them to him. He said, "No, Wendy, I don't recognize anything." I was thinking, well, this is obviously a linear layout of a town. That's very typical in Texas. It means it's along a railroad line. So I figured this was a railroad line. I figured there was a good chance these were taken by people from Bryan, coming down a road as far as they could get till it was flooded, and crossing a rail line. And certainly that situation exists at Allen Farm. But he said no. Well, the other place I was hoping it might be was northwest. And it turns out that was right. Eventually I discovered this is the town of Mumford at flood stage. And my friend Billy Dopsloff, who's up here, helped me confirm that with some newspaper articles she found about Mumford in 1916 that included some pictures with buildings in it that were these buildings. So this got me a clue. At least one of the pictures was from northwest or just north of Brazos County. Then my friend Liz Zamanek, who's not here today, introduced me to a man, Mr. Lee Fazzino, who's lived out in this part of Brazos County his whole life. And I showed Mr. Fazzino all these pictures, and he recognized a few of them for me. He saw this picture, and he said, "That is the Sims Plantation," and he took me there. It's still there today. We can see clearly the flooding here around the plantation house itself, which is still there. It's on the north side of Steel Store Road. This picture was in the series as well, and he couldn't identify it for me. But my friend Billy over here was going through all the microfilm of the eagle that are on the record there at the Carnegie Center. And she found some pictures of a plantation tour. And what caught her eye was she was looking for old images that I might use in this book. But the images as recorded on microfilm wasn't good enough quality to stick in the book, but it was good enough to clearly identify this house as being Roger Q. Aston's plantation house there south of Mumford. And you can see in the picture these guys are standing on the roof and the plantation is flooded. And then there was this image obviously taken from the roof looking out across here. And you can see the flooding extends. His plantation house looks to the east. All the way, the flooding extends all the way across to the Little Brazos River. I got a 1926 map from the USGS, a reclamation map. This I got from the archives of the Texas Land Office. And it shows the location of the Aston plantation. So the house was located here on a rail line, and the view was to the east all the way across to the Little Brazos River. You can see on this map 2 rail lines coming into the little town of Mumford. Both of these rail lines come from Bryan. This is the main line coming straight out of Bryan. This is the one that kind of detours to the west through downtown and comes up and actually went through the Aston Plantation. I've been trying to date the flooding pictures, and I'm of a mind that maybe there were 2 sets of floods in the picture, and I'm guessing, I don't know this, but I'm speculating that this might be from the kind of famous flood of 1913. The first one that was experienced after that levee was put in place. And the reason I'm saying maybe this is a 1913 flood is because every tree I can see in here is without leaves on it. And the 1913 flood was different in that it occurred in December of that year. Most of the great floods on record of the Brazos were in April through the summer into September. This is the only winter flood that I know of. Certainly the only one after the time of photography. So I'm wondering if this might be. My best guess is that this was from the flood of 1913. Now, during the flood of 1913, it was massive and it was shocking. And you can go through the newspaper accounts, which are on record in the vertical file there at the Carnegie Center. Very interesting story after story about the flooding and the effects on the population in the Brazos Bottom and the massive efforts that the citizenry of Bryan went to try to help the people here. And one article I came across talked about how many of the residents of the Brazos Bottom were rescued, and that almost all of them went to one of the local cotton gins. And we're seeing that here. If you look closely, you can see this is crammed with people. Here, you can see some critters over here. You can see some mules about to go under over here. The article said that 1,800 people were rescued from the Brazos Bottom and sent to 14 different gins scattered throughout the area, because virtually every plantation had a gin. Mr. Fazzino identified this particular one for me as the J.S. Morning Gin, and he showed me the location where it had been located. It's not in place anymore today. There's also this image included, and based upon the newspaper articles talking about the massive amount of help that the people tried to put in place to help with the rescue, you know, maybe was this the 1913 flood? I'm not sure. But during the 1913 flood, several prominent citizens lost their lives during the rescue efforts, being swept against a tree and knocked out of these boats. And this was in the archives of the family who lost one of the men in that rescue effort. So, you know, again, that's one more little hint that maybe it was from that particular flood. Possibly even one of these men was the man who was lost, but I can't establish that for sure. And then the last picture I want to show you is this aerial image, which I find to be really interesting. This is an image looking from north to south. This is the main channel of the Brazos River. This side is the high bank, so this is Brazos County side. Over here, all of this area that's flooded, this is the Burleson County side. You can see in the picture, here's the levee. Okay, so obviously this is a photograph after the levee was built in 1910. The first big flood was 1913. I think maybe this is from the 1921 flood. I don't know for sure. I don't think this is the 1913 flood because it doesn't look like winter to me. You can see the bridge across the Brazos. This is the old Jones Bridge, which is no longer standing. Today, the Highway 60 bridge is about here. The Jones Bridge was reported in the 1921 flood to have been damaged in the entryways to the bridge itself. And And in the 1926 flood, the center stanchion here on the bridge was damaged beyond repair, causing them to build a new bridge a few years later. So to me, this puts this image clearly in the realm of the 1920s. Again, it was undated. I just have the image. I don't have any documentation about it, but that's when I think it occurred. Okay, so that's really the end of my story, but I want to end it by saying there's a whole lot more to the story that I haven't told you guys. I'd like to say that I think the 1920s were a tipping point in how locally people thought about flood control. I think before that people were really interested and enthused about using levees as protection and help from flood control. But after devastating results from levees and floods after levees in 1913 and in 1921, people in this part of the world soured on the notion of levees as flood control. And they started thinking about the idea of building these earthen dams across rivers instead of parallel to them, and trying to impound water, not only for use so they could control the amount of water and the rate at which it was released downstream, but also to save the water for use during periods of drought. Once the dams started being built upriver, flooding continued, but not on as regular a basis, not on quite as widespread a basis. It also changed the scale at which people thought about flood control. When we started this talk, the scale was at the scale of the individual landowner himself or property owner, and then it moved up to the scale of government, but the scale was thinking about it at the level of the county. When you started talking about flood control moving upriver, the first major upriver effort was Possum Kingdom. You know, that's west of Fort Worth. We're talking about a different scale. We're not talking about flood control locally or at the level of the county. We're starting to invoke it at the level of the state. But that's not the part I'm interested in. I'm still interested in learning a lot more about at this first level. I'd like to learn so much more we could learn and add to this story about the levees. And that's where I like audiences like you guys, because you can help with that. I'd love to have old pictures of this, old pictures of building this levee, not just somebody else's levee, but this levee. Events related to, we know there were some problems in the camp. How did those problems manifest themselves? Did the rest of the community know about it, or was it handled just locally within the camp itself? Where were the levee camps located? How many of them were there? We know there was at least one levee camp, but the thing is 27 miles long. Surely they didn't commute to work 27 miles either on foot or via mules. There weren't enough mules for each guy. So it seems logical that the camps would have migrated. Well, where were they? What kind of artifacts might be left? What else could we learn about where these camps were and how these people lived? All of that's fascinating to me, and that's part of the story I'd love to tell you. Maybe I'll learn and I can come back another time. But for today, that's it. Thank you.